Hello, I'm Kat Winters. I am the author of several historical novels for teens and adults. I'm best known for my first novel, In the Shadow of Blackbirds, which is set during the time of the 1918 influenza pandemic. I have been asked a lot of questions by friends and families and readers about that flu compared to our current virus that's circulating around the world. I've especially had a lot of people asking me, how did people cope during that time period? What did they do to stop that virus? And how did it end? This was an H1N1 virus. There was no vaccine at the time, just like with our current pandemic. We could not rely on a vaccine, a shot, or a specific medicine to suddenly get it under control. So people back then, as they are now, relied on non-pharmaceutical interventions. That included quarantines, self-isolation, good hygiene, closures of places like schools, churches, theaters, limited public gatherings. But this was not done on a national or even a statewide scale. A lot of the closures and the methods requiring the public was done a lot of times on a city basis. Cities would go in and say, hey, we need to close all schools and churches and movie theaters. Right now we can't have any public gatherings. So it was done many times on a smaller scale, but it was shown to be effective when it was done. Studies of various cities across the United States from that time period showed that the cities that mandated closures tended to have a lower mortality rate. The deadliest wave started in September 1918. The peak of the pandemic really lasted between September through November of 1918. I specifically studied San Diego when I was writing In the Shadow of Blackbirds, so I really got a good idea of the day by day of what that city looked like during this time period. Balboa Park, an area of San Diego, had really excellent historical records that showed it was a daily log of what was happening in the city, and it included when the schools were closed, when the law to wear masks went into effect. They did have a law. There was a huge shortage of nurses during this time period because most of the nurses were shipped overseas to the war, so the American Red Cross issued a call for volunteers, so the public really had to get involved. By December 1918, the peak was starting to go down, but the flu was definitely still present. Public health officials worked to educate the public about hygiene, the warning about the dangers of coughing and sneezing. They worked on staggering work hours, encouraging employees to stagger work hours to avoid overcrowding of buildings and public transportation. I don't know, maybe that is something that we will get into here in our modern world as this pandemic continues, if it keeps continuing in further months. And by January 1919, there was a third wave. It was not as fatal as the second one, and that lasted till the summer. And at that point, you started seeing the flu really settling down. Of course, it came back seasonally as a seasonal flu, but you didn't see it being nearly as lethal as it was, especially in the fall of 1918. And even President Woodrow Wilson is said to have come down with it when he was at the Paris Peace Conference in April 1919, They tried to hide that from the public because they wanted to keep morale high. They wanted the United States didn't want to seem like their leader was falling ill with this awful virus, so they tried as much as possible to downplay his illness. But it sounds like he was hit pretty hard with it, but he did eventually recover. So the bottom line, though, of all this is that the virus did eventually slow down. We've heard of herd immunity, probably with this modern pandemic. Enough people had it when about a third of the population gets a virus. They do start having natural immunity to it, and just the hard work of the public of isolating themselves, of taking measures to control it. It did work, and they did find, studies did show, I might have said this already, that cities that did take action tended to have a lower mortality rate. And the bigger good news of all this is the 1920s followed the 1918 influenza pandemic. If you've seen 1920s movies, listened to the music, read the literature, you'll know that's the Jazz Age, usually associated with parties and liberation. A lot of great strides with the women's movement was starting to happen then. The 1920s was not perfect by far. I've written about that in some of my other novels, but you can see that people really embraced life, at least through the arts. You can see just that rising up from the ashes, the feeling of living life to the fullest. And I think that's directly a result of coming out of this very dark era of both war and flu, and just living life, knowing that how fragile it is. So I think what I'd like to tell people now, what I've been telling family members as friends, is just look to the 1920s. Think of that as being what came out of such a dark time period like the one we're living in now. There is hope. 1920s did eventually lead into the Great Depression. So like I always say with history, make sure you look at history, make sure you study it, make sure you learn from it. We have a lot of answers to our modern world just by looking at the past, and I feel like all the mistakes we make nowadays have already been made in the past, and we can learn from it if we read about it and study it and realize how it can be applied to our modern life. Good luck, everyone out there. I'm thinking of all of you. I'm staying in my house as much as possible so I can do my part to help control and eliminate this current virus. Stay strong. I'm thinking of you, and thank you for reading my books.